Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Tucker Marion and Dr. Sebastian Fixson as our distinguished guests on today's episode of the podcast. Before we begin in the conversation, let me take a moment to introduce our guest for today's episode. To begin, I am delighted to welcome our first guest today, Dr. Tucker Marion. Dr. Marion serves as an associate professor in the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Group at Northeastern University's D. Moray McKim School of Business, as well as in the Department of Mechanical and Industrial Engineering at the College of Engineering. His research focuses on new product development processes, lean processes for innovation, IT and design tools, and sourcing and cost engineering. Dr. Marion earned his PhD from the Pennsylvania State University. Joining us as our second guest today is Dr. Sebastian Fixson. Dr. Sebastian Fixson is the founding faculty director of the DBA program and a professor of innovation and design at Babson College. Dr. Fixson focuses on helping people and organizations build innovation capabilities, studying how process design practices like design thinking and digital and AI tools shape innovation outcomes, and he recently launched the Work Features Lab to expand this impact. Dr. Fixson writes for both academic and practitioner audiences, and his work has appeared in books and journals. He holds a PhD in technology, management, and policy from MIT. In this episode, both the guests discusses their book, The Innovation Navigator, Transforming Your Organization in the Era of AI. It is our great pleasure to now invite our guests into the conversation. Dr. Tucker and Dr. Sebastian, we are truly honored that you have accepted our invitation and delighted to have you with us today.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for the invitation as well. It's a pleasure to be here with you and your audience.
Thank you. Professor, you structured the book around 4 innovation modes: specialist, venture, community, and network. For leaders listening today, how can they quickly diagnose which mode currently dominates in their organization and whether that is still fit for the AI era?
Very good question. Let me maybe give a shot at answering it. Let me first introduce that when we were writing this book, Tucker and I have been researching innovation processes for over a decade. And we noticed that different technology advancement allowed innovation processes to be organized differently. And assembling more and more different examples made us think, what is the framework that sort of captures what we're observing? That led to the 4 different innovation modes the book is structured around. And the way to think about them is that they really span an area along 2 axes. The first one is whether or not an innovation process stays within an organization or crosses firm boundaries. And then the other axis is the question of the formality of the incentives. So in the old days, in most innovation functions, top management decided what project get resources, what to be worked on, and then the directives trickled down from there, if you will. Now the venture world over the last 20 and 30 years has shown us the enormous power of having people self-select into projects they want to work on. On the venture level, that always happens. But we notice that now those mechanisms can be employed inside of firms. So those 2 dimensions then, the crossing a firm boundary, yes or no, and the formality of the incentives create essentially a 2x2 matrix, which represents our 4 innovation modes.
Yeah, Dr. Marion.
One of the interesting things about Sebastian and I have worked together for almost 20 years now, and from the very beginning until today, is the impact of technology and also research on how firms innovate. And one of the things that we took away is that if we look at academic research, it can be very focused on a particular process or mechanism. Let's look at open innovation, for example, which has had enormous impact on how organizations like NASA can source ideas from outside the organization. But taking a higher level perspective, what we wanted to do with the original Innovation Navigator is kind of add context and develop a landscape where all of these different ways that you can innovate actually can work well together. And that's, to add to Sebastian's comments, that's where we have developed a matrix of both where innovation happens or comes from, and also how does it become and how is it incentivized and organized. And that is kind of the underlying principle, this 2x2 of the work, and showing that companies can have skills in individual areas or modes, as we call them, but they can also expand and try different modes, and they can actually work really well together.
Dr. Tucker, in the expanded edition, you describe AI as an innovation supercharger. Can you walk us through one concrete example from the book where AI fundamentally changed the creativity or decision-making dynamics of an innovation team?
Right. And before I give an example, I just wanted to give a little bit of historical context. When we wrote the first edition of the Innovation Navigator, we're exploring the confluence of two things. One of them was the rapid expansion of capabilities and accessibility to digital design tools like computer-aided design, simulation, additive manufacturing. And the second was changes in the way we collaborate and communicate and work through digital platforms like Slack and Skype, and originally Skype, and now all of our different video tools that we have together, and all of the things that fit in between that, right? And that really caused a perfect storm in how we can really rapidly design new products, create new knowledge, and share it, right? So that was really what we called in the first book kind of a perfect storm. A couple years ago, when we started looking at AI and what the impact of AI might have on the process itself, we realized that actually it's almost a third factor where it becomes, as you had noted, a turbocharger to those two other forces. So it's a force multiplier in what can happen in terms of the amount of knowledge that's created, how you can share that, collaborate, not only with other humans, but with other AI systems, and what that could potentially do to the efficiency and effectiveness of the innovation work itself. So I'm sure that almost every listener on this podcast, and including ourselves, have used large language models like ChatGPT and Claude and Google Gemini. And very quickly you can understand that you can get somewhat valuable knowledge very quickly by just texting and interfacing with it. What does that mean for the innovation process? Well, if it's used properly, it can actually greatly speed the efficiency where you are being able to synthesize information, collate it, get new information, and use that together to advance whatever part of the process you are working on. Now, one of the examples that we give in the book is a company called Loft Design. They're a design firm that's located in Providence, Rhode Island, and they have been early adopters of AI into their design thinking process. And one of the things that large language models are very good at is natural language processing, right? And so if you are able to have it synthesize product reviews or information or interview text from transcripts from interviewing people and performing ethnography, that's a very quick way to understand and tease out what are important factors that people are saying. What are the common most important factors that have bubbled up in 10 interviews, for example. And that can be done really, really quickly, as we've noted with most people's experimentations with LLMs. But going a step deeper, the better you structure your prompts and the better data that you upload into your session, you can start to get really interesting results out that are grounded in truth of the data that you are inputting. And a company like Loft is actually using that to better define personas, user personas of who might use a product, and then being able to take that and to speed up the development of the product by using other tools like Viscom and Midjourney and others. So what we've seen with companies like that is that they're really picking these different AI tools that are specialized in certain areas, combining them together, and being able to improve the efficiency of the front end of the process pretty dramatically. In the case of loft design, they estimate that it has improved the efficiency of the front end of that process, which can take a significant amount of time, by about 50%. So that means a benefit to the client, that they're getting results faster. And they also have demonstrated that they're getting better results, meaning concepts that are closer to, that better match the expectations of the client and the market itself. So that's just one example of an early adopter that is seeing real results in real time by using these tools.
Professor Sebastian, the book updates case studies from firms like Microsoft, Ford, Merck, and OpenAI. What did you learn from these companies about building innovation systems that remain resilient as technologies and markets shift so quickly?
Very good question. The question actually is three questions wrapped into one. So you're asking about innovation systems, you ask about whether they remain resilient, and you ask about response to quickly shifting markets. I think the resilience question I would like to put aside for a moment, because things move so fast. Whether a company or the innovation system will be resilient in 5 years, that's an empirical question we all will find out. We do know from past innovation research that it is actually very, very difficult for companies to maintain innovation capabilities over longer periods of time. Part of it has to do that the leadership changes in certain intervals. Part of it has to do that the market changes and that the required internal transformations are a difficult task to do. As far as the innovation systems, I think we will get to the multimodality in a little bit. Firms that try to work in multiple modes at the same time. But let me pick two examples from the list you mentioned as an indicator of what these firms are doing currently to improve their innovation capabilities as they are right now with help of AI. So if in Ford example, which is a 100-plus-year-old company, by and large, still in the same market, if you will, the same product category, by using tools like Viscom, which is a visualization tool for designers, where the AI support speeds the transition from sketches to almost photorealistic renderings up to a degree that it cuts out enormous amount of time. For organizations of that scale, the issue is not so much, can I give one designer or engineer this tool, but how do we encourage the use on a more broader scale? Now, on some level, designing and sketching is part of the workflow in automobile manufacturing anyway, or design. But it's a clear inefficiency argument there, and the widespread use suggests that at least this implementation is successful. If you look at another example, Merck, in a very, very different industry, right? Huge, very expensive outlays, billions of dollars for a single drug, and oftentimes the viability shows up only years into the process. So their AI takes on a much, much different role. If you think about the probability that a molecule is actually working as a new medication, it's a search in a gigantic haystack. And so if AI can reduce that search orders of magnitude, you can envision entirely different work streams. But you could very quickly explore entire sub-landscape and decide they're not worth searching there anymore, and focusing your efforts on those that matter. Right? So you can see that that capability will allow you to direct the resources and the activities of your employees in a very different way. And in Merck's case, it's also interesting to see that it went beyond the simple making available the tools to the researchers, but also forming habits and behavior of using those tools and sharing with each other. Because you can imagine, if you have highly educated R&D personnel, it's very unlikely that the boss knows the whole field and everything, can make a better decision, right? If you give them tools that raise the knowledge of the entire organization in unique mechanisms so that the knowledge is actually shared and used more collaboratively. So those are two examples where we saw that the AI addition significantly changed the way the work is actually conducted.
Professors, many organizations still treat AI as a set of tools, not as a change in how innovation work itself is organized. How do the four modes of innovation look different once AI is embedded into everyday product development and problem solving?
So I'll take a first shot at answering that. It's a very good question. So we're only a couple years into this iteration of AI, and of course, there's been machine learning, and the discipline of artificial intelligence has been around for many decades, and there has been great progress, followed by winters where there's less progress, and now, of course, we're in the latest spring or summer of this version of AI research and application that's driven largely by transformers. And if you look at the propagation of tools over the last 4 to 5 years, many of them are general models like a ChatGPT or a Claude, and they have increasingly improved capabilities in all areas, from generating new content to helping draft papers or summarize things or develop graphs or PowerPoint slides or whatever kind of workflow that you're looking at. And that certainly helps individual workflows on a daily basis, be it coming up with ideas for a birthday party or helping to synthesize a research paper into a better abstract, right? So the one thing that I think that has been very startling to people or amazing to people is the fact that you are going to get an answer regardless of what you put in and ask a large language model. Now, the question is how accurate that answer is, and that depends on a number of different things. The baseline data that it's trained on, what is the subject that you're asking, how you're asking it, how you're prompting it, those sorts of things. And I think that's beyond the scope of this to get into those details. But so we've seen the usage or adoption rate be very, very steep of general large language models. Now, over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen the development and implementation, first starting with pilots and now being increasingly adopted, of very specific tools for specific tasks. So Sebastian had mentioned Viscom. Viscom is a tool for visual product design, both 2 and 3D design, where you can get photorealistic renderings and change them very, very quickly. That has a very specific application in the industrial design of physical products, for example, from shoes to automobiles to consumer products. So there you have a tool that is very specific to a task. You may have another tool like Grammarly that has adopted AI to help individuals write better and to formulate better sentences. Midjourney for creating visual and presentations, those sorts of things. So each one of those attacks a very specific workflow. You will see that also in almost all industries. Some are focused on workflow efficiency and effectiveness in healthcare. Some might be for accounting. And over the last year or so, when we hear about agentic AI, it is really thinking about augmented and automated workflows for very specific tasks that are trained on models that are experts for that task, right? So be it drug development or be it performing or automatically developing better spreadsheets in a financial task, that's you could argue that's the state of the art right now, and there are thousands of startup companies all over the world working on these different workflow pieces. The question is that how quickly are these going to be adopted? Some might be very valuable and have a very good value proposition. Many will not. So eventually, over the next 5 years, you will see, and this happens in every blossoming of a new technology, lots of different solutions. And over time, many of those will drop away, and we will have some that remain as the de facto standard. We saw that, of course, with internet search engines. At one time, there were 20, 25 search engines, and now we have a couple, right? That won out in those technology and use battles over time. You will see that with agentic AI and just AI in general.
Yeah, Professor Sebastian.
So what I would add are probably two things. One is that your question was how the modes look different. Well, when we wrote this expanded version, and we go at length into this in the forward, we were actually wondering, should we write a new book? How has AI changed the world so much that the book is no longer useful? And we debated this and pushed the model back and forth and realized in the end, the two dimensions that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast are actually social questions, right? The firm boundary is a legal construct that humans have created. And the incentives are there to encourage employees to, or outsiders, to contribute to some effort. Those two things fundamentally are social elements and have per se nothing to do with AI. Now, what is true is that as a tool, it affects all of these modes, makes them much faster, makes them moving, it makes them capable to attack much larger solution spaces, problem spaces, all of that. I think those firms that work in the specialized modes are the most traditional one. It's not surprising that you see the first application of AI and tools, because inside their organizational structures and their own mental models, that's the smallest change, right? You have a task and let's see, can I do it faster? In the extreme, can I get rid of it and automate it completely? But this thinking is in the same space. Now, what we do see is in environments where, for instance, venture teams, given the freedom to not only reinvent the product or solution they're working on, but how they get there, that's where new workflows are much easier to invent, because you don't have to debate with an existing workflow and have to win the argument why yours is better. It's simply because none exists, and you can create the one that works for you and moves the fastest. At that point, what I would expect we will see some sort of evolutionary selection process. So if you watch young students, for instance, their workflow is vastly different from what we are used to in established organizations. Now, when they have their first job, they might have to be forced to learn the existing workflow, or when they launch their own company, they will work the way they want to work. And I do think we will see quite some innovation there of how firms internally actually work.
Right. And I'd like to add to that, Sebastian. In some of our earlier work, if you look at the use of digital design tools, originally you had mechanical engineers and then draftsmen would take that idea and express it in a drawing and may hand that off to a machinist. When we digitize that process, we may have combined the mechanical engineer could now use computer-aided design, and they could perform some of the drafting drawings themselves. And now today, we can perform the concept, the drawing, the simulation, and getting it ready for manufacture, all by the same individual. So you have multiple different workflows coming together. And I think to Sebastian's point, in noticing the younger generation, if an individual now, because the barriers to entry are so low in some of these tools, you can create a design, express it visually, and also begin very early coding almost instantaneously to develop a prototype very, very quickly. So we hear a lot about vibe coding, and that's using, an augmented tool to help speed up the development, deployment, testing of code, right? And now we've got students that can be, or individuals working at companies that can do many of these tasks very, very quickly, either by using single tools or by knitting together different tools to allow progress, particularly in the front end of innovation, really, really quickly. And that's changing the perspective of what people might do, how they may work, and the tools they use to generate new output, right? And I think that's one of the most exciting things about what you're seeing now as AI matures a little bit in people using it and seeing what it is useful for.
Professors, we talk about new metrics for managing innovation in the AI era. Which one or two metrics do you think leaders should stop obsessing over, and which new ones should they start tracking on a monthly dashboard?
That's a very good question. In fact, I think the measurement of innovation is a fairly poorly solved problem, period, fundamentally, before AI and after AI. Part of it has to do is that we live in an uncertain world, and innovation, as the name suggests, creates something new. So we don't know ex ante where we will end. Interestingly enough, if you look at academic research and practical research, you will find that most organizations use lagging indicators in the end. And part of it is because that's where we have data. We can look at financial results, admittedly, often multi-periods after the decisions were made. And then we sort of conclude, well, it must have been a decision we made a year ago that led to this sales bump or revenue increase or share increase or whatever the measure might be. I think those financial measures, I think, will be with us, right? The world we live in, we can't really live without them. However, for the people driving the innovation projects inside, what we feel is what is necessary is far more closer at the project, right? So if you are an innovation manager driving a project forward, yes, you will be expected 2 years from now to deliver a certain value to the company. But what's the relationship if you are working on a project that has never done before? How are you supposed to know, are you on the right track? So our fundamental argument in this chapter in the book is that we need measures that are much, much closer to the work. And we borrow from 3 different disciplines, design, engineering, and entrepreneurship, to come up with a framework and saying, these are the measures that every project goes through. And we have, at least in bits and pieces, elements of how to do that, right? So in the engineering world, the study of complex system has resulted in scales for technical maturity levels, etc. And we borrow sort of this thinking from there and saying, but there are actually ways to determine how much risk on the technical level is in a product or system on its way to market. Similarly, on the design side, it's really what we teach in design thinking courses, a much, much deeper understanding of users and trying to understand, am I solving the right problem here? Because if that's not the case, then a lot of resources can be invested into something that ultimately no one needs. And then on the trailing end, and these 3 sets sort of are overlapping, gets closer and closer to the market, and in entrepreneurship, original in the software world, but more and more also in the hardware space, there are measures of early customer feedback, early sales, etc., and sales trajectories, even when the volumes are still small, that allows you to better understand whether you're on the right path. And given that AI will allow us to look at many, many, many more options, will require us to evaluate many, many more options. So the need for those types of measures will grow in this world.
Yeah, Dr. Tucker, please.
Yeah, in the book that we propose a conceptual framework for how we might think about in-process measures, and it does draw from entrepreneurship, also technology, and then also engineering as well, to refocus the perspective from lagging to leading indicators. And I think that to follow on what Sebastian was talking about in terms of trying to evaluate the plethora of options that AI will give us now, because knowledge creation is so efficient, is that we need, one of the opportunities for AI is the ability to do predictive scoring on performance of different of those options, right? So one of the things that you're starting to see in the tech world is, can we develop solutions that are going to predict the performance of things before we commit more resources to them? being in be it product design and development or other areas where investment later on becomes increasingly higher. And that is, I think that's one of the burgeoning areas that AI will be really effective, is to at least give individuals and management a suite of measures that they can think and evaluate whether or not all those various options are worth pursuing further.
Professor Sebastian, the community and network modes rely heavily on partners, platforms, and external contributors. In your research for this edition, what have you learned about governing these ecosystems so that they remain creative without become chaotic?
Very good question. I think the short answer is incentives are key. Why people participate and what they expect to come out of this. Fundamentally, you can think for both of these modes, there's a range of configurations, if you will, right? You can create collaborative environments, communities function that way, or you can have a competitive environment, contests functions that way, right? Typically, humans are motivated by a mix of intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, incentives. And either of them has its role to play. So for example, in the community mode, you do find very collaborative setups where just being a member of a community and interacting with the other members while solving problems provides a benefit to participants, and that keeps them in the community and returning to the work, if you will. There are other models, however, that are designed as a clear contest. So if you think about these intermediaries, Innocentive, yet to come, Obazuku, who have a problem owner and then essentially broadcast this question anonymized to a set of potential solution providers who don't know each other, different from a community, but then essentially compete for a prize money. So both of these models can be very effective depending on what you want to do. Now, you want to be careful in mixing the two. In fact, one of the long studies we have run was a system that, due to its own growth, tilted from initially collaborative into competitive and ultimately collapsed under its own weight. So the incentives matter, and it has to be carefully thought through how they can maintain or how they can incentivize the behavior you want to see, number one. And number two, how to maintain the contribution level over time, which is why in the network mode, you typically see a more complicated set, but more stable set of larger players. So for instance, how companies interact with each other. In the book, we talk about very large industrial supply chains like Boeing's, how those are organized, and you can see very different outcomes for different planes when they use different structures. Another example we use is a software company originally from the CAD area that was the first web-based version of a CAD model, who then morphed into essentially a platform where other solution providers could, through APIs, offer their own services, right? So now you have not only collaborators, but you have the quasi-marketplace, and you have to carefully think through which players is incentivized, which way, in what form, and how can you make the entire system work.
Professor Tucker, the book emphasizes multi-mode strategies using specialist, venture, community, and network modes in combination. What are some typical failure patterns you see when companies try to be multi-mode but end up with confusion or duplication instead?
Thank you. That's a great question. So, in the book that we described the four modes, as you had just alluded to, and in looking at successful implementation of multi-mode companies, one of the things is to implement a clear strategy for how you're going to approach innovation and embedding these different modes into the overall process. We found that there are modes that work well together. So, for example, Apple, over its history, has implemented a lot of venture mode strategies into the front end of their development. So if you look all the way back to the original Macintosh, to the recent development of the defunct Apple car, they really did approach these projects as somewhat standalone and as a new venture within that organization during the early development. And then as they approach detailed design and commercialization, really involve their network of partner organizations in manufacturing, component development, software development, and others. So Apple has done a really interesting strategic partnership between the venture mode and the network mode. Others may try different strategies. For example, you might have a company that's really interested to engage with an external community of passionate users, for example. Those users may be incentivized just because of their own desires to show the company what they've come up with. A perfect example of that is Lego, who has a global network of adult passionate users that propose advanced kits to Lego, and some of those are selected and become their kind of multi-thousand piece kits, like their Saturn V rocket that came out about 10 years ago, right? So that's a really good use of the inherent efficiency of getting lots of ideas from the outside for low cost. Now, the question is what do you pair that next with? You can compare it, in the case of Lego, with a strong, what we would call specialist mode, where they have internal experts that are going to source the right pieces, make new ones if needed. How many total pieces will be needed in that kit, so on and so forth. And that is a very strategic pairing of the best of the community mode with the best of the specialist mode. Where things may fall apart is if you go into a mode and there's really no strategy behind it. You might try a contest with the community, nothing really happens, or you might engage with some universities and some startups to try to develop some sort of network, but it doesn't really go anywhere because there's no true incentive or strategy to embed that in the organization, right? The other thing which is to build on what Sebastian was talking about earlier is the incentives within the organization. I think that any of these modes require not only support from the top down, but also bottom up support, and how valuable, and that is the empowerment and the ability for individuals to be involved in these different ways to innovate, we've seen as being instrumental or key to being able to implement them effectively.
Professor Sebastian, this edition adds a strong focus on employee skill development in an AI-rich environment. What are the must-have skills you believe every innovation professional should build in the next 3 to 5 years?
I guess that's the million-dollar question everybody's asking. And what are the future-proof skills? I think I would separate it into 3 buckets. The first one is, some people describe it as AI literacy, right? So the recommendation is, wherever you work, AI is not going to go away. Will it take over? Will it automate X percentage of jobs? I think that's still an empirical question we will find out. But some futurists suggest that AI will fade into the background, sort of like the productivity software all of us use every day. It's just there. So I think the recommendation there is then use different tools for the task you're already doing and seeing if it helps or not. The advantage of using it there is you're already experts in your specific workflow. In other words, you have the ability to judge the outcome, the quality, the ethical way in which it was created. So get used to and make the choices based on whether it's useful, and if your company has an appropriate governance structure. But as an individual, so use AI, learn how to use it and in your work. The second set, I would say, is maintain your ability to collaborate with humans, right? So empathy, communication, sort of the traditional skills. Unless and until everything gets automated, we will still collaborate with other humans. And so this is a very valuable skill that needs to be maintained. And then in the third bucket, I would put skills that I would label entrepreneurial skills. And the reason really is that in the world that is so transformed by AI, what will happen to supply chains, workflows, is that the value will move inside these chains. So maybe typically the value is highest where in a workflow and bottleneck exists. If AI can get rid of this bottleneck and take care of that constraint, the bottleneck will flow somewhere else. And knowing that where the value will be ultimately created will help everyone to understand where to expand their knowledge, typically along the value chain. So in our earlier work, we found that this is actually happening, that tools allow to individuals to take on more tasks along left and right of their own step in the value chain, if you will. But the identification of where that is what entrepreneurs do all of the time, trying to find out where can value be created that other people find useful and valuable.
Professor Tucker, looking across the cases in the book, where did you see AI actually limit or distort innovation, perhaps by over-optimizing for what's easy to measure? And how can leaders guard against those unintended consequences?
Sure. Again, that's another great question, and it's one that Sebastian and I have wondered about a lot with the migration and digital transformation of how people design and work on things. Because AI is a step function of improvement in the ability for us to see new outputs of knowledge. Now, we can argue whether or not that knowledge is what the quality of that knowledge is, but AI can help improve the efficiency of creating things for humans to look at. Now, the question is whether the important question is whether or not that information is of sufficient quality or not. At some point in the phases, it's less important. In the very beginning of ideation, you might want to just have lots of ideas and spark some creativity. And it really doesn't matter whether or not the output that you're getting from an AI is right or not, because you're just looking for ideas and ideation, and that's fine. Where things start to get worrisome is parts of the process that require things to be absolutely nearly 100% correct, right? And that's where trust comes into the equation, right? Because the way current transformers and large language models work, they're dependent on the training and the underlying data. They may not be sufficiently trained to give a 99.999% accurate answer on the design of a very important component in a jet engine. We're not there yet. So the trust in some of these applications needs to be very, very, very high. There are limitations currently with AI to be able to do that as effectively as you would want to do. Now, enormous progress is being made in all areas, but we still have to understand where there are limitations with our current systems, right? And we're not there where we can have an AI completely design an aircraft engine and be comfortable with the fact that it is going to be as good or better than a human design team with all the tools that we have today. That just doesn't exist. Now, will we get there? Probably. We don't know when, but that's certainly what researchers around the world and companies are working on. So, managers need to understand the limitations. Right now, in the very beginning and getting ideas and ideation, AI is wonderful for very specific trust-based things of having extreme confidence in a very hard engineering question. It's less trustworthy. So we need to understand that spectrum, okay? The other thing is that if the outputs have gone exponentially, to greater heights, and our ability to revise and iterate, we stand the chance of iterating too much, right? And that's one thing that Sebastian and I have thought about a lot over the last 20 years is because you can do something easily also means that you can do it way too much and too long, right? But that still doesn't change the fact that we need to select the best options as humans, either working in, jointly with AI, and we need to have a discipline of process to understand when enough is enough, or when your iterations are actually having diminishing returns on a project or for performance. And that can be an issue when we have the ease with which we can create, iterate, and revise. So that process still needs to be managed very carefully. In tying that back to KPIs or key performance indicators, maybe there's a way that AI can tell us when we are going too far. And we're only, very incrementally improving something and that it is worth moving on, right? So we call that, backloading, right? And that can have, an impact on the entire innovation process itself. The other thing is that one of the things that Sebastian and I have thought about is the actual skills required from individuals. And we published an article a couple of years ago about the four skills that people will need in the age of AI. And one of them is to really have knowledge of the entire system. And at least in the foreseeable future, to understand when an output and you're working together with an AI of when things make sense or do not, at least a fundamental understanding of multiple things and how all of these processes work together, right? And I think that, as these tools become more and more powerful and our workflows change, we still need to have an overall perspective of objectives of the project. What are those key performance measures that we're looking at? And do we as humans need to step in and to take an active role in whether or not we need to shift focus or manage things more appropriately?
Professors, as we wrap up, one final question. If a listener picks up the Innovation Navigator after this conversation, what practical experiment or pilot project would you recommend they run in the next 90 days to start transforming their innovation system?
I think my my general advice would be similar to what I said earlier about the individual skills, which is start trying, right? But that's only one half of it. I think the Merck example showed nicely that it's one thing that provide tools or access to tools to people so that they can explore how to do their own work more efficiently, or perhaps even come up with entirely new output. But equally important as an organizational level, you want to capture that learning and trying to make sense of it in the organization. So in Merck's case, they had these communities of practice, but you can think about different ways of capturing insights, learning, and sharing them across the organization. So not only start trying something, but also be cognizant about that somewhere in the organization, a lot of learning is happening, and you need to make that more broadly available for the organization to learn.
Professor Marion.
And to add to that, I do think I would certainly agree with Sebastian that I think experimentation right away is very important. I also think that there needs to be a baseline of general understanding of how the tools work themselves. I think that right now many people look at them as a black box, and to really understand how they can be impactful to you individually and for the organization, you need to understand how they work, how they're trained, where the data comes from, and what to expect from the outputs. And as I had mentioned this a couple times, how trustworthy those outputs are, because I think that will help you direct when and where they can be useful immediately, and where we might need to take a step back and either wait or develop tools internally or with external partners that specifically meet the challenges that whatever innovation work you're doing requires.
Professors, this has been a truly insightful conversation from your book. Your perspectives on innovation, AI, and the future of work have given us a richer and more structured way to think about how organizations can navigate change. On behalf of Businesstalk and all our listeners, thank you for taking this time to share your research, your experiences, and your practical guidance with us today. It's been an honor to host you on this episode, and we look forward to continuing this dialogue through your book and future of work. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much for having us. It was great
Thank you for
fun.
having us. It was a pleasure. Thank you.